We are now officially midway into 2024, and now I think it's safe for us to say that this year is going to be one of the weakest for animated movies. There has yet to be a great animated movie that has come out this year, and with the exception of The Wild Robot, which looks absolutely gorgeous, I don't think there's going to be another standout animated movie that will come out later this year. I think now it's safe for me to say that this is a very weak year for animated movies. You have Megamind 2, which is Megamind 2. You have Kung Fu Panda 4, which I haven't watched yet, but I've heard it's very mediocre, if not straight up bad, according to some people. I don't know. You have the Garfield movie, which it's fine. It's a movie that exists. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just really average. A perfectly fine, perfectly safe kids movie. Nothing awful, nothing offensive, but it's not a very memorable movie either. It doesn't have much rewatch value at all. And now you have Pixar's newest movie, Inside Out 2, a sequel to the 2015 blockbuster. I gotta admit that I didn't have much expectations going into this movie. I didn't feel excited or anything like that for it. When the movie was first announced back in 2022, I thought, okay, sure, why not? Maybe a sequel to Inside Out could work. And then as time went on, as we got more and more trailers for this movie and we got closer to the release date, I started thinking, yeah, nah, I don't have much interest in this movie at all. I watched the trailers for this movie and I think this is just gonna be the same thing as the first movie. I mean, obviously there are gonna be differences, but the general plot is gonna remain the same as the first movie. And so when the movie finally released and I sat down to watch it, I sailed the 7 seas for it, of course, because Disney. My fears were unfortunately true. This is just the exact same thing as the first movie. I saw the largely positive reviews that this movie was getting, and I was hoping maybe this could end up being another fluke for Pixar. I've brought this up numerous times before, but Pixar back in the 2000s was basically unrivaled. They were just putting out nothing but masterpieces in the 2000s. And then once Cars 2 rolled around in 2011, all of a sudden the bangers started to disappear. We still got good movies. The movies that came out after Cars 2 were still good, but they just weren't on the same level as their pre-Cars 2 movies. But then on rare occasions though, you did get a few movies from them that were just as good as their pre-Cars 2 material, and that includes the first Inside Out. At the same time though, as we all know, Pixar isn't really the best when it comes to making sequels. Besides Toy Story 2 and Toy Story 3, most of Pixar's sequels are, again, they're not terrible, but they're nowhere near as good as their original movies. Finding Dory isn't as good as Finding Nemo. Incredibles 2 isn't as good as Incredibles 1, that sort of thing. And now, unfortunately, Inside Out 2 continues the tradition of being nowhere near as good as its first movie. Again, it's literally the exact same thing as the first movie. You've watched Inside Out? Well, congratulations, you've already watched Inside Out 2 as well by default. Now, I would like to state that this movie isn't bad or anything like that. There is nothing wrong with this movie. This movie doesn't do anything terrible. I keep bringing up that this movie is just a carbon copy of the first movie, but it's not like it does anything worse. There's nothing to make this movie worse than the first one. Well, I mean, okay, it is worse than the first one, but it's more like, it's not like it just repeats the plot of the first film and does it in a much worse manner. No, it just does the exact same thing that the first film did, and that makes it worse because it's just, there's nothing to make it fresh, there's nothing to make it unique, there's nothing like that at all. Part of what made the first Inside Out one of the few great modern Pixar movies was its different, unique premise. The ideas and concepts that it had felt different, they felt fresh, they felt unique for a Pixar movie, for any animated movie for that matter. And yes, Inside Out 2 does have new ideas implemented into them, and they are executed well. It's not like they're badly executed or anything like that, but what was fresh and unique the first time isn't going to feel fresh or unique a second time around. Watching this movie made me realize it's surprisingly pretty common for Pixar sequels to just feel the same as their original movies. Like, when you really think about it, Finding Dory is just kind of the same thing as Finding Nemo. Obviously there are differences, but the general idea behind it is still the same. And then Incredibles 2, I brought it up when I reviewed it. It's basically the same thing as the first Incredibles, except that the main characters are swapped. In the first Incredibles, Bob is the one that does all the superhero stuff while Helen stays at home. In Incredibles 2, Helen is the one that does all the superhero stuff while Bob stays at home. I'm surprised nobody has ever brought this up when talking about why Pixar sequels aren't all that great. I don't even know if Inside Out really is the kind of movie that should get a sequel. It's in this like weird in-between area where it's like it has a lot of good ideas for a sequel. The potential for a sequel is there, and for what it's worth, the movie does have ideas in it. Like the idea of having Riley be a teenager now, having her go through puberty, that could allow for new ideas for this series. But at the same time, I feel like Inside Out probably would have been better if it was just a one-time standalone movie and that's it. I criticize the fact that this is just the same thing as the first movie, but to be fair, I don't know how else you can do an Inside Out sequel. I can't help but feel that like this movie feels rushed to me. Like, I don't know how to describe it, but something about this movie, like, it feels like it's missing something. It feels rushed to me. I don't know how I could be able to elaborate on that. It just kind of feels rushed. I guess maybe it's just the fact that originally you had Elio. Yeah, remember that? That was a movie that was supposed to come out this year, and now it's coming out next year. Elio was supposed to come out in early 2024, before this movie, but it's been delayed to 2025. It's gonna come out after Inside Out 2. And I guess that kind of caused more work to be done faster on Inside Out 2. I don't know. Like, I brought this up again in the Incredibles 2 video, but it's like kind of similar to what happened with Incredibles 2 and Toy Story 4. Toy Story 4 was originally supposed to come out in 2018, while Incredibles 2 was supposed to come out in 2019, but then the two movies swapped release dates, and that caused Incredibles 2 to lose an entire year of development, and I think that could have greatly contributed to the very underwhelming nature of the movie, because it was kind of rushed. Granted, things might be a bit different, because I'm pretty sure from the beginning this movie was planned to come out in the summer of 2024, but I don't know, I can't help but feel that there are parallels between these two situations. If I were to give the movie some praise, I'll say this: the animation is, as per usual with Pixar movies, absolutely stunning. In one scene of the movie, two characters appear. I don't know if I want to count this as a spoiler, because these characters only appear one time in the movie, and again, there isn't really much to spoil for this movie because it's the same exact thing as the first Inside Out, but there's one scene in the movie where the main five emotions meet two characters. One of these characters is this like 2D cartoon character. Apparently he's meant to be a character from a show that Riley watched when she was a baby, and he's like 2D animated and cartoony, and he's meant to be a parody of Dora the Explorer and Mickey Mouse Clubhouse and shows like that. And then the other character is, I think his name is Lance/Blade, and they actually like showed him off before the movie came out, like in pre-release images, and he's supposed to be this like PS2 era character that Riley had a crush on when she was a kid. I gotta be honest, I'm more impressed with Lance/Blade because like they were able to nail the PS2 graphic style for this character. It honestly feels kind of refreshing. I'm glad they didn't go with some pixelated 8-bit style character. I'm glad they decided to go with something unique, something different, and so they go with this like GameCube PS2 Cloud Strife-esque esque character. Both characters only appear in one scene and that's it. It's not like they're main characters or anything like that, but I figured I might as well give some praise to the movie for this. Unfortunately, there isn't really much to make this movie stand out on its own when compared to the first film. The general plot stays the same. In the first movie, something happens to Joy and Sadness that causes them to get kicked out of the headquarters, and so they spend the whole movie trying to get back to the headquarters. Meanwhile, the remaining three emotions, fear, anger, and disgust, all try to take care of Riley in the headquarters, and everything they do just negatively affects Riley because she's missing those two essential emotions, joy and sadness. This movie is the exact same thing. The new emotions kick the five main emotions from the first movie out of the headquarters, and so they spend the entire movie trying to get back to the headquarters. Meanwhile, all of the new emotions, particularly anxiety, try to help out Riley in the headquarters, doing things that they think would help her out, but instead it just makes things worse for her. It's the exact same thing as the first movie. Obviously, there are different themes in this movie when compared to in the first one. You know, you have the whole thing of Riley being a teenager now, her going through puberty, that's new stuff. But it's not enough to make the movie feel different or fresh from the first movie. Most of the movie is just a rehash of the first Inside Out, except it's not as good as the first movie. You can't just do the exact same thing a second time and expect the results to be just as good. That's not how it works. A great sequel is one that actually expands on everything that made the first movie so good, and it makes it even better. Like, could you imagine an alternate universe where The Empire Strikes Back was just the same thing as A New Hope? It would be nowhere near as good. It would be nowhere near as critically acclaimed. Empire Strikes Back is a completely different adventure from A New Hope, and that's what makes it so good. It expands on everything that made A New Hope great, and it makes it even better. That's how you make a great sequel. Inside Out 2 is just the same thing as the first film. There is nothing wrong with this movie at all. It's not terrible or anything like that. It's watchable, but it doesn't feel fresh. It doesn't feel unique. It doesn't feel anything like that at all. There's almost no reason to watch this movie at all. Why would you waste your time watching what is essentially a watered down version of the first Inside Out? The first Inside Out was a fresh out of the oven fancy meal that you would eat at a 5-star restaurant. Inside Out 2 is the reheated microwave leftovers from the night before. It's still edible, you can still eat it, but it's just nowhere near as good as it was when you ate it at that restaurant. As it stands, Inside Out 2 is just a movie that exists, which, I mean, to be fair, you could say the exact same thing for a lot of modern Pixar movies. At this point, I think we should all just accept that Pixar is not going to have a second golden age. That nearly perfect 11-film streak that they had from 1995 to 2010, they're never gonna have anything like that again. Pixar can still make good movies, of course. I'm not saying that these are bad movies or anything like that, but it's just they're not going to be as remembered as their earlier movies. They don't have the same longevity that their older films had. Whenever people think of Pixar movies, they think of stuff like Monsters Inc. and Ratatouille. They don't think of Onward or Luca. I'm willing to bet that this movie will end up being forgotten about. The first Inside Out has already cemented itself as a modern animated classic, one of the few masterpiece Pixar movies post Cars 2. But then Inside Out 2 is just, it's not a bad film or anything like that. It's far from a bad film, but there's nothing to make it amazing. There's nothing to make it stand out. It just feels like a watered down, inferior version of the first movie. That is the only real problem with this movie, but it is a massive problem that greatly hinders the movie. There's a strong chance that this could end up being the first successful Pixar Pixar movie in years, both critically and commercially. And that concerns me because number one, this movie isn't all that great, and number two, this is a sequel. Let's have a recap of the last 5 years for Pixar, shall we? 2019. You got Toy Story 4, a sequel, which to date stands as the most recent successful Pixar movie, both critically and commercially. It stands as their most recent box office success. Following that, in early 2020, you have Onward, an original movie, which would end up becoming a box office flop due to its theatrical run getting cut short due to the pandemic. The next 3 Pixar movies, Soul from 2020, Luca from 2021, and Turning Red from 2022, are all original movies, and they all had their theatrical releases cancelled due to the pandemic. They were all instead released onto Disney+. I think earlier this year they tried doing something where they had all 3 of these movies in theaters for the first time, but by that point it was just redundant to do it. There was no reason to watch these movies now in theaters since, you have Disney+ or someone owns them on physical media, etc. So it was just redundant for them to do that. I saw virtually nobody talk about these 3 movies getting theatrical re-releases, so yeah, that completely backfired for Pixar. After that, in the summer of 2022, you got Lightyear, the first non-original Pixar movie since Toy Story 4, as it is a spin-off of Toy Story itself, and it's also the first theatrical Pixar movie since Onward. Unfortunately though, the movie ends up being a massive box office flop, and it also receives mediocre to poor reviews, with many people, myself included, looking at it as a low point for the once legendary studio. The following year, in 2023, you get Elemental, another original movie, which ends up getting good reviews. However, the movie initially performs poorly, but then it becomes a bit of a minor box office success. I don't know. I really don't want to go into that whole debate of if this movie is a box office flop or a box office success. It's not something that I want to go over. But even if this movie was a box office success, it wasn't like a huge success or anything like that. And finally, we cut to the present day, 2024, with Inside Out 2, a sequel, the first proper Pixar sequel since Toy Story 4 5 years prior. And this movie is very likely going to be a box office success on account of the fact that it is a sequel to one of the more popular modern Pixar movies, which will likely cause Pixar to take the wrong message away from this, that nobody wants original stories and everyone just wants sequels and whatever. Like, I think there was that whole interview recently where it's like they said that they didn't want any more movies that were based on like people's personal lives, like Luca or Turning Red, and instead they wanted movies that had more mass appeal, like Inside Out 2. And it's like, even though I don't think Luca or Turning Red are particularly great movies, I can at least admire them for trying to do something different. And now we're just never gonna get anything like that for the upcoming years. It's just gonna be nothing but sequels. And it's the exact same thing with Disney as well. The last few Disney movies have all been original stories, and they've all performed poorly critically and commercially. And so now Disney assumes that what we want are sequels to their already existing movies. And so now all of a sudden we're getting Frozen 3, Moana 2, Zootopia 2, etc. Even though the problem with these movies is not that they're original, the problem is that they're not very good movies. Regardless of how it performs critically, if Moana 2 ends up being a box office success compared to Strange World or Wish, that's just gonna give Disney the wrong idea. It's gonna make them think that now, instead of wanting subpar original movies, we want subpar sequels to great movies. It's just really fucking bleak looking at their upcoming slate of animated movies. It's especially bleak for Pixar. It's like, what the happened to these guys? How do you go from making game-changing animated movies in the 2000s to making Lightyear? Like, what the happened? Inside Out 2 is not a bad movie. I feel like I've said that a lot in this video, but it's true. By no means is this a terrible movie, but it just doesn't feel necessary. Watching this movie just made me miss the perfect quality of movies like WALL-E and Ratatouille even more than I already did. It's crazy how one bad sequel was enough to completely change the quality of an entire studio's output. But the thing is, Pixar is still capable of putting out masterpieces every once in a while post Cars 2. The first Inside Out and Soul are both fantastic movies. It shows that Pixar still has that magic in them. But I always point to Coco whenever I want to acknowledge that Pixar can still make a masterpiece, because Coco is a top 5 Pixar movie right there. This is a movie that shows me that Pixar still has that magic in them. They could still be able to create a masterpiece. They could still make a movie that, unlike most of their other modern movies, could stand the test of time and become an animated classic. Something that will have a legacy, something that will have lasting impact, something people will remember. And so naturally, it would only makes sense that Pixar would follow up their best modern movie with 2 movies that perfectly showcase why they are not as good as they used to be. Just wonderful. Inside Out 2 is a cute movie. It's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just a heavily watered down, inferior version of the first movie. The emotional moments in this movie just don't hit the same as they did in the first movie, because everything just feels so derivative of the first movie. Just to get something out of the way, no, there is nothing in this movie that comes close to being as emotionally hitting as Bing Bong's death in the first movie. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is up for you to decide. There are a couple of things that make this movie stand out from the first film, but it's not enough to save it. I don't see this movie becoming a future Pixar classic. Even though I was never hyped for this movie, there was a small part of me that hoped that it would end up being one of the few great movies they would put out post Cars 2. An exception movie, a successful fluke similar to the first Inside Out. But unfortunately, Inside Out 2 is just more of the same. And that just greatly disappoints me, really. I honestly kind of don't recommend you watch this movie because, in addition to, Disney, don't give your money to Disney, there's also the fact that, why would you want to waste $20 on a movie that's just, you've already seen this movie. This is the exact same thing as the first movie. There's no reason to watch this movie at all. This is probably the first time where it's like, okay, you know what, this is a good movie, don't watch it. I don't recommend it at all. It's not that this is a bad movie, it's just kind of an unnecessary movie more than anything else. Again, I don't know how else you could make a sequel to Inside Out that isn't just the same thing as the first movie, but still. I think now it's safe to say that Inside Out is officially part of that club of great animated movies that unfortunately never got sequels. Such a shame if you ask me, but whatever. Happens, I guess. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Adios.